Chapter 10. Détente, 1960 to 1968. When John Fitzgerald Kennedy became President of the United States in January 1961, the Cold War was at its height. The attempt to help Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba was a disaster, and the Bay of Pigs incident escalated world tension. At the same time, interracial relations worsened, and the country which aspired to the moral leadership of the world appeared as the oppressor of minorities. In Laos and Vietnam, guerrilla activity became more intense and was not brought under control in time, and in East Berlin there occurred a momentous event. Construction was begun on the Berlin Wall. From the end of the war, over 2 million people had left the eastern sector. On the night of August 13, 1961, in order to put an end to the situation, direct orders from Moscow commanded the army to start the construction of barriers and fortifications, blocking the passing points. On August 15th, the barbed wire was replaced by concrete blocks. The wall of shame separated families and made Berlin the decisive point in the Cold War. The Germans were reluctant to lose their freedom. They fled and were machine-gunned, and once again the sacrifices were the useless offering of the people against oppression. In order to stop communist expansion, Kennedy created the Peace Corps, volunteers who attended to hardship at home and abroad. The Alliance for Progress was set up. This was an attempt at peaceful revolution in Latin America. Kennedy kept the word he gave at his inauguration speech to allow the poor to be able to help themselves. In the United States, there was an economic revival, but it would not last long. Kennedy brought youthfulness and prestige to the White House with men like Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, and Robert Kennedy. He also introduced laws and reforms which reduced unemployment, ensured medical attention, lowered taxes, and advocated civil rights. But one thing was an altruistic willingness, and another thing was hard facts. The Vienna summit meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev did not prevent the Cold War freezing over in 1962 after the missile problem. Cuba had allowed the installation of launch pads for Soviet rockets, and Kennedy ordered a blockade. The world held its breath for 5 days. The thorny problem was solved thanks to the important role played by U Thant, who had become Secretary General of the United Nations that year. In 1963, the Kremlin and the White House were connected by a red telephone in order to prevent the dramatic possibility of a war breaking out by mistake. In the end, good sense prevailed. Atomic weapons had become so lethal that for the first time man could destroy his habitat just by pressing a button. In Moscow, the United States, the USSR, and the United Kingdom agreed to limit nuclear tests. France refused to sign, as did China, which at that time was the 5th country with nuclear technology. In domestic policy, Kennedy submitted a civil rights bill to Congress. He was involved in this struggle when he was shot dead in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. The Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, sworn in as president on the tragic day, flew to Washington. He met with the world leaders who attended Kennedy's funeral. The police arrested the assassin, who was killed when he was being transferred from one jail to another. The Warren Commission, appointed to investigate the Magnacide, convinced no one. Johnson, who gave priority to the anti-poverty policy, asked Congress for $1,000 million. The anti-poverty bill included Kennedy's program, grants, youth centers, community activities, loans for farm workers, farmers, and small businesses. Johnson was a candidate at the 1964 elections and knew that if he wanted to win, he had to continue the Kennedy line. The votes for him were votes for the dead president. That year, the Civil Rights Act was voted into force and signed by Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Johnson's political program, the Great Society, was charged with social content and stressed the health programs, Medicare, immigration, disarmament, lowering of taxes, housing and nature conservation. In 1965, a new immigration law came into force, a new minimum wage was laid down and made applicable to farm workers. Congress was urged to increase Social Security allowances and improve the standard of living of the poor. However, the amount assigned to Vietnam was also increased in 1968. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. A white man staked out at the window of a building opposite his hotel put an end to the life of the leader of the Negro movement. There was a wave of violence. Rioting, fire, destruction, and civil disobedience were the order of the day in the Negro ghettos. The National Guard had to be called in. Underlying this were racism, youth unemployment, and the hard conditions of life for the Negro minority. As regards foreign policy, Vietnam was an obsession. Ideally, the South would have been able to defend itself, but the escalation of Viet Cong activity in 1964 made intervention inevitable. The excuse was insignificant. 3 small launches had attacked an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson sent troops as he believed this was a lightning strike. It was the most tragic mistake made in modern American history. Throughout 1965, the number of troops increased. The bombing of North Vietnam was ordered while efforts were made to end hostilities. In 1966, Johnson met the South Vietnamese leaders in Hawaii, and this resulted in the Declaration of Honolulu, but not in peace. Months later, napalm attacks were increased. The population became sensitive to the war. When Johnson traveled to Guam in 1967 in order to discuss peace, there was a general outcry for peace. In March 1968, the President of the United States declared that he would not stand for re-election and called for peace negotiation, which Hanoi accepted. Those in favor of withdrawal supported Eugene McCarthy. Shortly afterwards, Robert Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey announced their candidatures. On June 6, 1968, Shihan Bishata, a young Jordanian, shot Robert Kennedy, who died later in a Los Angeles clinic. The senator had opposed Lyndon Johnson's policy on Southeast Asia, but his dream of becoming president had been cut short. Latin America was seeking a way to break with imperialism. Che Guevara thought that parliamentary confrontation would never bring freedom, and this idea was assumed by the young. After becoming Minister of Economy and Work, his differences with Fidel Castro led to him leaving for the Congo, although he and the Africans were never able to understand each other. In 1966, he tried to spread guerrilla warfare throughout America, beginning with Bolivia. In 1967, with the help of experts from the CIA, he was captured and executed by Bolivian forces and buried in a common grave in Valle Grande, and the greatest revolutionary legend of our century was created. In 1965, the Marines landed in the Dominican Republic after the assassination some years previously of the dictator Trujillo. In 1960, Venezuela, one of the founders of the OPEC, took front stage after the student rising in Caracas. Romulo Betancourt suspended constitutional guarantees and the guerrillas increased their activities. Raúl Leone promised to end the situation. He was unable to, and in the incidents with university students in Maracaibo and Caracas in 1968, they were dead and wounded. In Mexico, discontent was growing when Díaz Ordaz became president. The situation became unsustainable in 1968. Student demonstrations were repressed with terrible brutality. On October 2nd, during a concentration in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco, the army opened fire with bazookas and provoked a massacre which shook the world on the eve of the Olympic Games. In Europe, political life was varied. In France, it was conditioned by the Algerian situation. De Gaulle was given full powers to combat the crisis in 1960. The following year, 4 generals rebelled in Algeria, 2 surrendered, and the others began terrorist activities with the OAS, Organisation de l'Armée Secrète. In 1962, the Evian-les-Bains Agreement relieved the situation. That year, the Prime Minister stood down and Georges Pompidou became Prime Minister. He recognized the independence of Algeria. De Gaulle proposed a referendum to elect the president directly and threatened to leave if the answer was no. He won. De Gaulle's foreign policy was polemical. He refused to allow Britain into the common market. He recognized Mao's China and demanded special treatment for France in NATO. His popularity grew, and at the end of 1965, he defeated Mitterrand and the Democrat Jean Le Canuet. Shortly afterwards, France withdrew from NATO. May 1968 seemed to be about to overthrow the French government. The events, which began as a protest against the Vietnam War, ended up with the seizing of the Sorbonne, the Stock Exchange, and the Odeon. The assembly was dissolved. De Gaulle won double the number of seats than the combined seats of the other parties. Chinese-Soviet relations had been deteriorating since 1959, and Nikita Khrushchev traveled to Peking for the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Popular Republic of China. The Soviet leader discussed the dangers of using force with the man who was the first secretary of the Communist Party from 1953 to 1964. He wanted to attract the Chinese into the Soviet orbit, but he failed. Neither did his successors. Brezhnev and Kosygin managed to reach an understanding with Mao, who had abandoned the presidency in order to plan the revolution. The differences grew. Mao believed that, in the long run, war with the West was inevitable. Khrushchev knew that that way of thinking would lead to disaster. Relations became colder, and Russia withdrew its technicians. The split worsened in Moscow in 1963 when the Chinese delegates abandoned the conference table, which had been summoned to smooth relations. Russia accused Mao of splitting up the communist world and introduced a new factor: racism. Mao accused Khrushchev of betraying the Marxist cause in order to ally himself with the United States and Nehru's India. Nehru was succeeded by his daughter, Indira Gandhi, on his death in 1964. The Chinese Cultural Revolution, with Mao's Little Red Book being waved by millions of youths in defiant mood, shook the world in 1966. This was an anti-Western movement, and it also left the Russians in a bad state, as they were accused of being revisionist and imperialist. In 1965, the German Federal Republic established diplomatic relations with Israel in the face of a growing climate of protest and demonstrations in the Arab world. In June 1967, Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense and ex-Chief of Staff, plotted a lightning attack. The 6 days war was fought between Israel and the Arab world. At dawn on June the 5th, Israeli fighters flying at ground level to avoid enemy radar destroyed the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces on the ground and put runways, airport infrastructures, and even the Iraqi airport of Haben Yinya out of action. On land, his strategy involved the Egyptian front in the Sinai, where the Israeli tanks cut Gaza off from the rest of the Egyptian territory, on the Jordanian front in Jerusalem and Transjordan, where Jerusalem was taken. On June the 6th, Egypt and Jordan accused the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom of supplying air cover for Israel. NASA sank several ships in the Suez Canal to prevent navigation. The canal was absolutely necessary for the Western countries, and the Arab countries also declared an oil embargo on those countries involved in helping Israel. On June the 7th, Egyptian resistance ceased in the Sinai and Israel seized its arsenal. Jerusalem, Nablus, and Jericho were taken while it advanced towards the Jordan. On June the 8th, Israel was in control of Suez and Nasser accepted the ceasefire. The Syrians, who had bombarded Israel from Mount Hermon to the Sea of Galilee, lost the Golan Heights, and Israel penetrated 20 kilometers into Syria. The United Nations demanded that Israel desist from its Syrian offensive. In the United Kingdom, Harold Macmillan, a conciliatory politician, gave credit to his party's slogan, "Life is better with the Conservatives." Wages rose 20% and 20% of families improved their standard of living. Macmillan restored good relations with the United States and was successful with his foreign policy. However, faced with an adverse economic situation, he was obliged to take deflationary measures. The internal situation of his party deteriorated, and the French veto on British entry to the common market was a humiliation. Worst of all, the Profumo affair, involving the Minister of Defense, was brought to light. This was the last straw, and Macmillan resigned. In Germany, Heinrich Lübke, the president, agreed with Chancellor Adenauer that foreign policy was just as vital as domestic policy. In 1962, relations with France were excellent. The Chancellor's visit to Paris had been a success, and a cooperation treaty was signed. In October that year, Adenauer left the Chancellery. The Bundestag appointed Ludwig Erhard as Chancellor, who was to hold the post until 1966 and become the other architect of economic recovery. That year's elections were dominated by the economic crisis and resulted in the formation of a new government presided over by Kurt George Kissinger, with a coalition government in which Willy Brandt was Foreign Secretary. In 1967, Konrad Adenauer, the man who had rebuilt and reunified Germany, died at the age of 91 in Rondorf. At the start of the decade, Italy was also undergoing strikes and protests. Amministore Fanfani solved the crisis by moving to the left through a coalition with Giuseppe Saragat in 1962. A year later, the Communists won 25% of the vote cast. Faced with this situation, Aldo Moro, the new prime minister, formed a center-left government which led to a period of stability. Tension with Austria over the Alto Adige became more acute in 1965. In 1962, the Church underwent changes at the hands of a pope who had not been expected to take the initiative. This was Pope John XXIII, who inaugurated the Second Vatican Council in Rome. In 1963, Paul VI inherited his ecumenical spirit and presided over the Vatican Council, which closed 3 years later. The Third World began to make itself aware to the social conscience. After the Second World War, it became evident that colonialism could not be continued. In 1960, the United Nations recognized the rights of peoples, and Africa became a mosaic of nations, many of which had frontiers which did not correspond to the historical reality of the continent. Only Ethiopia, Liberia, and Egypt were independent nations. In the year that Belgium left the Congo, Patricio Lumumba described colonialism thus: "We have known exhausting work with wages which could hardly satisfy our hunger. We have known insults, blows, and being dispossessed of our lands. The law was lenient for the white man and cruel for the black. Exiled from our own land, our destiny was worse than death." However, at the beginning, independence meant only conflict. Neither Patricio Lumumba, the leader of the national movement, prime minister after the precipitated withdrawal of Belgium in 1960, nor President Kasavubu could impose order. The troops mutinied. Moses Tshombe declared Katanga independent. Colonel Mobutu's coup d'etat put an end to Lumumba's political career, and shortly afterwards he was assassinated. In 1962, the United Nations peace plan was accepted, but this did not solve the problems. Not all the ex-colonies had such traumatic beginnings. From 1960 on, the majority of African countries became independent. Tokyo had been unable to hold the 1940 Olympic Games owing to the World War. In 1964, the Games were held there and transmitted to the world by satellite for the first time. The Olympic flame was carried by a 19-year-old boy who had been born in Hiroshima on the day that the atom bomb was dropped. However, not everything was wonderful. In 1961, thalidomide, a sedative with terrible consequences, was being talked of. Three years later, Christian Barnard transplanted the heart of a young black man to a white patient. This was the first heart transplant operation. 1961 was a spectacular year for the space race. Yuri Gagarin circled the Earth in the first manned satellite, Vostok 1, which went round the Earth every hour and a half at 28,000 kilometers per hour. In 1958, NASA began its first project for manned flights, the Mercury program. 25 missions were made involving 4 animals and 6 astronauts until the program was completed. In May 1961, the United States sent its first astronaut, Shepard, into space, and 2 years later the Russians sent Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman cosmonaut on board Vostok 6. In 1964, the probe Ranger 6 arrived on the Moon, but unexpected damage to the television camera prevented transmissions. A year later, Edward White left Gemini 4 and made the first spacewalk. The giant rocket Saturn, designed to carry the Apollo capsule, which would take man to the Moon, was launched. The industrial robot appeared. It did the work of a man at a third of the cost, and with the advantage that it could work where man could not. Kennedy had given a world press conference using a revolutionary system, Telstar, a satellite which started a new era in the world of communications. Cinema lost one of its greatest legends. In 1960, Clark Gable died after finishing The Misfits with the unforgettable Marilyn Monroe. In 1961, Gary Cooper died, and a year later, another legend, Marilyn Monroe. Alfred Hitchcock filmed Psychosis and The Birds, while people were touched by West Side Story, which meant an Oscar for Rita Moreno, the best secondary actress. In 1960, the Oscar for Best Film went to Billy Wilder's The Apartment, although its leading actor Jack Lemmon did not win. Lemmon had already won the coveted statue in 1955 for Mr. Roberts. Maximilian Schnell received the award for Best Actor for his excellent work in Judgment at Nuremberg. Although high fashion continued to be elitist at the 1960 Paris parades, fashion was soon to be dominated by the miniskirt. In 1965, the fashion designer Courrèges brought out his popular short futuristic youthful line. Coco Chanel, the queen of chic fashion, thought this was the most ridiculous of things. She was wrong. That novel idea was taken up by Mary Quant at her bazaar in the King's Road, where she revolutionized skirts by simply shortening them. The dress changed the image. The insolent style of swinging London became the style of youth. Miniskirts, colored stockings, square-cut hairstyle, white makeup with eyes outlined in black, and extreme slimness in imitation of Twiggy, whose slim figure and angelical face went round the world. Life changed. Social taboos were banished, and the women's liberation movement took shape together with pacifist protests, freedom of conscience, and lifestyles. There were those who took advantage of these sentiments and the desire for change felt by the young. Gurus, Oriental mystics, appeared everywhere, promising new knowledge and gaining thousands of followers. The protest song began. This social artistic style was performed by Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Donovan, and their tunes were sung in underground halls, squares, and university campuses where they formed opinion. 4 boys from Liverpool shook the world with a new, fresh, revitalized style. They had begun in the Cavern in Hamburg, and their music was to be a fundamental sign of change. The Beatles meant something more than the songs of Lennon and McCartney. They were the opposition to the established order, the victory of the new over the immobile attitude of their elders. The Rolling Stones, who were much more radical than the Beatles, revitalized rock and roll when rhythm and blues seemed to have lost momentum in the United States. Musical tastes were changing. the soft black music of the Platters passed to the forceful James Brown. Soul music triumphed with Otis Redding and the blues with B.B. King. Elvis was world famous by the time of King Creole. Psychedelic rock began in California, but it hid a danger: LSD. The young slid unawares through the sweetness of the hipper movement towards drugs. Elvis shared fame with the Beatles. In 1963, the young people crowded together to hear From Me to You, which whipped up enthusiasm for their idols with their high-pitched voices and panting rhythm. Beatlemania had begun. 4 English boys conquered America. Some young Southerners burned their records and Elvis reported them to the FBI, but by then it was to no avail. Everyone was singing, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." The young thought they could change the world and fought on 3 fronts: Vietnam, civil rights, and the defense of nature. But perhaps this was no more than the dream of youth.